Spoil na ata yung dinry ko dito. Pagkarado ko eh. Na-spoil nga eh. What the fuck? Hello? Get the fuck out of the way. Fucking cat. Ka dyan. Oh shit. Ay, ng pusa to. Sino yung ano mo? Yung ano mo? Eh? Ano? What? Ah, meron ako ditong ano. Cables. Hindi pa kung yung bahay ko masyadong malaki. Puro ka ng 2 stories. Masyadong malaki. Ano?
你们接受采访吗？
我们
哎，中国队吗？哦，你们接受采访吗？
我们只接受央视。
只接受央视的采访。哦，那其他媒体为什么他们怎么说的呢？
对
哦，
对
的。哦，OK，好，谢谢啊。
The Olympics has threatened to kick the USA out of the Olympic bid for 2034 in Salt Lake City, and take a guess why? China. And hamburgers.
I don't want to watch that on stream.
Hey everyone, it's Connor here from Durham Hearing Specialists. I hope you're doing well, and welcome back to a very interesting case. This is quite different. This isn't going to be a beautiful, lovely ear cleaning video. This is an ear infection, one of the worst I've seen, and I'll explain why. I'm just going to pause it here quickly. So, I mean, even if you don't work in healthcare and you don't have any sort of medical, biological training, you can clearly tell that this ear is infected, because right there you have lots and lots of pus. Now, you may be wondering why there are bubbles in the pus. It could be that the patient's eustachian tube has been opening and closing. But I think that those are bubbles of oxygen, because this patient has done the worst thing that they possibly could have done, and they've applied lots and lots of hydrogen peroxide-based ear drops to this ear. Now, the reason that that's terrible...
Dahil ba sa ano to?
Hey everyone, it's Connor here from Durham Hearing Specialists. I hope you're doing well, and
Dahil ba sa
welcome
mga
back to a very interesting case. This is quite different. This isn't going to be a beautiful, lovely ear cleaning video. This is an ear infection, one of the worst I've seen, and I'll explain why. I'm just going to pause it here quickly. So, I mean, even if you don't work in healthcare and you don't have any sort of medical, biological training, you can clearly tell that this ear is infected, because right there you have lots and lots of pus. Now, you may be wondering why there are bubbles in the pus. It could be that the patient's eustachian tube has been opening and closing. But I think that those are bubbles of oxygen, because this patient has done the worst thing that they possibly could have done, and they've applied lots and lots of hydrogen peroxide-based ear drops to this ear. Now, the reason that that's terrible is because there are two gaping huge perforations of this eardrum. So, and that will become clear in a moment as I suction away some of this debris. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that this was suppurative otitis media. And I'll just pause it again. So this part here, at the time, now looking back, it's obvious what's going on here, but at the time, I thought this was just really like a really just sort of inflamed edematous part of the ear canal. I thought that was just a really swollen part of the ear canal, and then the eardrum would be lurking behind this pus somewhere. That is not the case. That's actually the posterior half of the person's eardrum. And again, once I kind of remove a little globule of dead skin, you'll be able to see the handle of the malleus more clearly. So just getting rid of some initial discharge and debris, and also you can see the discharge is pulsatile. Can you see that fluid, you know, pulsing in and out of the perforation? At that point, whenever you see pulsatile discharge like that, it's usually a clear sign that there's a middle ear infection. And the reason it's pulsing like that is not because there's a huge blood vessel lurking behind there. It's just due to the general huge amounts of inflammation and therefore vasodilation of the mucosa lining of the middle ear. So that's why it's pulsing like that. But again, that is usually a very clear sign that this is suppurative otitis media. And suppurative, just to explain that terminology, the word suppurative in the kind of medical sense usually means something to do with pus. So the generation or discharging of pus, and in this case, pus is being generated in the middle ear and then leaking through these perforations. So, and the word is derived from Latin, as most medical terms are, either Latin or Greek, but in this case it's Latin. And it's derived from the word supero, or superare, which means pus. So I'm going to pause it again here. So that's the eardrum, what's intact of it, and these two holes here are gigantic perforations, and that right there is the handle of the malleus. So what we have here is an eardrum with two perforations, and you may think, as I did at the time, that this kind of gooey, kind of white portion is just a bit of sort of, you know, mucousy discharge rubbish. Yeah, I'm just sucking up some discharge here. You can see that the discharge is actually kind of gluey. So it's, you know, undoubtedly, you know, a soup of dead skin and, you know, mucosal discharge and pus. So, yeah, so that sort of white part there, which is separating the two perforations, I thought that was just discharge and muck and things like that. And I was expecting it to be really just one huge perforation. But as I'm just kind of kissing the surface of it, I do actually think that that's intact tissue, living tissue. So I wasn't too keen to actually, you know, poke and prod it that much. So yeah, I mean, that, you know, if that was just discharge, that would have sucked up by now. So I think that is intact tissue there. But, you know, there we have this, you know, heavily inflamed, infected eardrum and middle ear. And just to explain what's going on inside the middle ear. So, you know, your ear canal and eardrum, you know, when you look at it with a scope, what you're really seeing is just ordinary skin, you know, epithelium skin. But then behind the eardrum, there's a cavity inside your skull. And that cavity is lined with respiratory mucosa. So the same type of mucousy tissue that you would find in your nasal cavity and down your throat. And obviously what's happened here, I'm not exactly sure what's caused these perforations. The patient history is a little bit sketchy. He said he has had perforations before, long time ago in the past, but they'd healed up. And, you know, this, you know, the pain and discomfort he felt in his ear started a few days ago, and he's applied the hydrogen peroxide drops in anticipation that there's just a wax blockage. But this is, you know, clearly more than that. And my hope is that, you know, there's been no damage to the inner ear, the cochlea, because the kind of concern around the hydrogen peroxide drops is that usually when you apply hydrogen peroxide, usually it will dissociate. The chemical reaction is such that hydrogen peroxide should turn into water and oxygen, which is why I thought those large bubbles were bubbles of oxygen. I think that's probably the most likely explanation. But hydrogen peroxide definitely should not find its way into the middle ear, because sometimes, it depends how the chemical reaction goes down, but what you can end up with is that the hydrogen peroxide will turn into water, but you'll also then be left with something called a hydroxyl group, which is like an oxygen and a hydrogen atom, and that's what we call a free radical. And a free radical is like a molecule that can damage the cells of your body and damage the DNA, things like that. And so there we go. There is our suppurative otitis media. It's a very, very bad case. And I think, I mean, at this point, I looked at the ear and discussed it with the patient, and I decided just to send him straight to ENT. I think this is now very much within the realms of an ENT consultant to deal with this. So if I hear back from this patient, I will let you know. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. Hi everyone, it's Connor here from Durham Hearing Specialists. I hope you're doing well, and welcome to another very interesting case here. What we have in this video is bilateral acute otitis externa. So if that sounds like jargon to you, I will explain it. Bilateral just means on both sides. So this is the patient's right ear, I think, and then shortly after you'll see the left ear as well, which is also horrendously infected. The right ear doesn't take me too long. The left ear takes me considerably longer, just because there was more pus and dead skin on that side. And then the other part of the name, acute otitis externa, otitis, oto is ear and itis is inflammation. So typically if you hear itis in the name of anything, it's inflamed, basically. The tissue is inflamed. So otitis. Externa, that just means the external ear, the bit that you can see and feel and touch. As opposed to otitis media, that would be the middle ear, which is the tiny little air-filled space behind your eardrum, or otitis interna, but nobody really calls it that, so most people just call it labyrinthitis. You can see just here the sheer amount of pus that's in this ear, and those little white globules that are in the pus, that's just dead skin. So yeah, most people call the inner ear the labyrinth, and if you have an infection there, then it's labyrinthitis. So that's otitis externa. The acute part of the name, most people will say acute if they take that interpretation to mean that it's a bacterial infection. So you can have inflammation of tissue due to several things. You know, it can be trauma, so there's tissue damage due to trauma. Could be an allergic reaction, could be, you know, inflammation caused by a noxious substance. But acute otitis externa, we take that to mean inflammation which is due to a bacterial invasion of the tissue. Excuse me. So that's where the name comes from. And you may be thinking at this point, well, why hasn't he just been prescribed medicine rather than going through this, you know, kind of whole laborious process of suction? This particular patient has already tried medicine. He's already been prescribed medicine by his general practitioner doctor, but that's failed. That has not resolved the problem. And it's quite possible that by the time he was prescribed something, there was already quite a lot of debris and discharge and biofilm in his ear, which is why the medication failed. So the idea behind this procedure is to tread lightly, because there's no anesthesia here, tread lightly and clear out as much pus and dead skin as we can. And the thinking behind that is that, and I've mentioned before on several other videos, particularly those featuring infection, but basically bacteria like to live on and colonize and eat dead skin. And that's basically what a biofilm is. So biofilm, pretty much all of you watching this video will have biofilm on you or in you, you know, in one way or another. Most of you have plaque on your teeth, and that's what biofilm is. It is a living colony of bacteria. And in cases like this, and if there are any doctors or nurses watching, you will know this from working with wounds and leg ulcers and things. Bacteria and ear infections are most often caused by Staph aureus or Pseudomonas. Bacteria like to colonize, and when they colonize, they kind of exude this unusual and interesting slime in which the bacteria can then proliferate. And then the reason that biofilm is terrible is because if you allow this bacteria to colonize and form this slime, whether it's in the ear or in a leg ulcer, that allows the bacteria to actually share genetic information. And that is one of the root causes of bacteria developing resistance to medicines. So, for example, mentioned just then Staph aureus, Staphylococcus aureus. That's a very common type of bacteria, not just for ear infections. And just to pause slightly, that's the finished product, heavily inflamed eardrum. This is where we were before, just a complete soup, really. And you know, the finished product is not perfect, but it's as much as the patient could tolerate. So we're moving on to the other ear now. But Staphylococcus aureus is the name of a bacteria that's very common for ear infections and, you know, wound infections and all sorts. If that sounds jargon to you again, you will have definitely heard of Staph aureus before, because you will have heard of MRSA, which is a particularly difficult infection to treat because it stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So you may have heard of it in the news and things, or you may have heard of it as a hospital-acquired infection. But it's essentially an infection that's very difficult to treat with medicine because the Staph aureus has developed a resistance to certain drugs. So again, when a doctor or a nurse or whoever sees kind of a sluffiness in a wound, then which is kind of like a kind of pussy, dead skin kind of gel-like film, then they'll immediately try and get rid of it. So anyway, and interestingly, the name Staphylococcus aureus, again, that may sound like jargon, but the name is actually very simple. Most of these names are derived from how the things look under the microscope. So Staphylo is, I think it's Greek for a bunch of grapes. And when you look at Staph aureus under a microscope, they will not kind of be in chains or like sparse. They'll actually clump together like a bunch of grapes. And they're spherical as well, which is where coccus comes from. So if you see cocci or coccus in the name of a bacteria, that means it's round, like strep throat. So streptococcus will also be a round bacteria. Although I think streptococcus will form in chains, unlike Staphylococcus aureus, which forms in bunches. And then the aureus part of the name, those of you who are keen on history will know aureus is like a Roman golden coin in aureus, and aurum is also Latin for gold. So, and that's why gold on the periodic table, the chemical symbol for gold is Au for aurum. But In any case, what we're trying to do here is, as tenderly as possible, try and get rid of all this pus and, most importantly, the dead skin. And then that will pave the way for medicine to have an effect. So, and after this procedure, I telephoned the patient's general practitioner doctor and spoke to her. And she was very helpful and organised a prescription for the patient that day. And then the patient went to the pharmacy and just picked it up. So a very smooth process. But again, we essentially want to get rid of all the possible biofilms that are in this ear. We want to get rid of all this dead skin, you know, this very moist, you know, pussy dead skin, such that, you know, there's less of a chance of the infection recurring, and obviously there's more of a chance of the medicine working first time round. And you can see here, what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to sort of, you know, scrape the suction probe along the canal. I know that's what it looks like I'm doing, but I'm being very, very careful to just with the slightest amount of pressure here. This is when having the steady hand comes into effect. The slightest of pressures to sort of move the suction probe along that lining of dead skin and pus, and just again strip away these layers here. And the reason we have to be careful is because, as you know, as you can imagine, the infected tissue is very sensitive. I mean, it's not too bad in the outer third of the canal, because, I mean, that's just, you know, there's a nice cushiony layer of cartilage and fat there. But when you get deeper and it's just very thin skin on bone, because the inner 2/3 of the ear canal are just very thin bone, skin on bone, that can be extremely sensitive. It's quite painful, actually, even if your ear isn't infected. If you kind of bump around in that area, in that bony portion of the ear canal, it is very, very painful. So again, you can see we've made some progress. Now, this was the more difficult of the two. And again, we're not going to get perfection here. But just down here, you can see the eardrum is actually visible, the lower half. You may not be able to identify it, but if you kind of look at the lower half of the what's in shot, you can kind of see the shiny grey tissue showing through behind the sort of brown tissue. That's the eardrum. And what's happened here is that this brown layer of dead skin is essentially covering the eardrum. And we have to be incredibly careful here, because again, we don't want to cause any discomfort. We certainly don't want the patient to, I should probably clarify just there, discomfort is not the end of the world. But the reason that I'm often nervous about causing discomfort, again, because there's no anesthesia, is that I don't really want the patient to kind of suddenly make sudden movements to, like, you know, to kind of jerk their head around. Because I'm so close to the eardrum, I'm so close to all this, you know, inflamed tissue, and the last thing I want to do is kind of knock my suction probe against the tissue and then cause bleeding, which again is not the end of the world, but it's not great if you're that close to the eardrum. Most of the time, if you're too heavy-handed and you do kind of cause a little pressure on a certain part of the canal, again, most of the time, if they're going to move their head or if they're going to make a sudden movement, it'll be away from you. So it's not too bad. But again, it's just a risk that we really don't want to take. So again, I'm just kind of, at this point, I'm just seeing how far I can go, really. The patient's starting to get a little bit jittery. And again, I'm in constant communication with the patient. So again, I'm saying, is this okay? How are you feeling? Is there any dizziness? Is there any discomfort? And so on and so forth. The dizziness, the reason I ask about dizziness is purely because the suction has a mild cooling effect, particularly if you're close to the drum, and that can cause a cooling of fluid in the inner ear, the labyrinth, which I mentioned earlier. And that can cause kind of weird currents in the fluid inside the labyrinth, and that can cause dizziness. So in other words, those currents make your brain think that you're moving your head when you're not, and that causes a movement of the eyes, and it makes you feel a bit weird. The same thing can also happen with when you're getting your ear cleaned out with syringing or irrigation. So I'm just sort of seeing how much dead skin I can get here. But again, the patient's, at this point in the video, I think the patient was just about ready for me to back off. They'd just about had enough, which is fine. Again, I totally appreciate their position. And it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to just kind of keep plowing on without the patient's consent. fairly sure that's illegal. But also it doesn't make any sense to keep on ploughing on if they had enough, you know, when they're starting to get uncomfortable. They're more likely then to kind of make sudden movements. So again, it doesn't look overly recognizable. So if you know what an eardrum looks like, this does not look very recognizable because the drum is inflamed, and it's also got, again, that thin layer of dead skin, which I've been unable to peel thus far. But again, the idea behind this is basically to clean it as best we can. And from where we started, again, we're in a much better position now, and the medicine that's going to be prescribed is going to make good contact with that infected tissue. And the medicine that's been prescribed, so the general practitioner doctor is going to prescribe Otamize, which many of you will have heard of, and that contains an antibiotic agent, neomycin. And when neomycin, I'll just give you a before and after. So that's the before, again, a complete and total pus and dead soup, really. And this is where we are afterwards, right down to the eardrum. So a fairly good outcome considering where we started from. But the medication, neomycin's an antibiotic agent. And when neomycin comes into contact with bacteria, it will basically mess up the bacteria's ability to synthesize proteins. So it basically messes up the bacteria's ability to function properly. And it also contains acetic acid, which is important, really, really important, because the acetic acid, which is vinegar, will kill any remaining biofilms that are in there. And then it contains a steroid as well, dexamethasone. So there we go. Quite a nice video, I thought. That was a very interesting case. And it's, again, a good opportunity to talk about bacteria, which is a very, very interesting subject, and how bacteria sort of change and evolve, and the study of bacteria is a whole science in and of itself. So very interesting. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section below, and I will try my very best to get back to you.
Men going their own way.
You don't need to go through the rejection.
Good day, fellas.
Japanese adults don't understand the younger generation. All Japanese school children wear the same backpacks, which are called randasiru. These are unrealistically cool briefcases with orthopedic backs, but they are quite massive and heavy, especially for elementary school students. Despite the fact that all textbooks are usually stored under the desk in the classroom, school children came up with a special adaptation. Now the backpack can no longer be carried on their shoulders, but carried behind them on a gurney. But adults in Japan have taken it in two ways. It's the country with the largest number of elderly people, and many of them don't want to change the way they grew up. Many said the heavy backpack builds endurance and helps build muscle. There was no such auxiliary device in their time, and they grew up healthy and strong. And in general, they thought the carrier looked strange. The school children's invention didn't become very popular. What do you think about it? Subscribe and like.
Yeah, one of the things that you'll find that's really weird about this, right? Like we've talked to people who are using AI generated code, and they're like, hey, I'm a programmer, and it would take me like maybe 1 hour to go and produce this thing, and maybe like 15 minutes to debug. And then they were like, oh, the AI would produce it in like 1 minute, and then it would take me like 3 hours to debug it. And they're like, yeah, but it produced it really fast. It's like, dude, you're losing so much efficiency using this just dog shit code. And then a lot of the times what they found is once they got past that debugging phase, they're like, oh shit, it doesn't even integrate. I have to go do it myself anyway. And you're like, God damn it, dude. Yeah, one of the things that you'll find that's really weird.
Guys, when
I can tell you unequivocally when you're about to get old, and it's based on your advertising bracket on YouTube. These are the age ranges. When you move from one to the next, you have aged infinitely. Yeah, that's it. Live every day like you know how many age brackets it is until you're irrelevant to advertisers. I got 2 left. I got these 2, and then advertisers don't give a shit about me anymore. I can tell you unequivocally when you're about to get old, and it's
Chinese men's gymnastics team lost gold to Japan, and internet users in China went crazy about the athletes who made mistakes that cost them the gold. And they're accused of intentionally losing to Japan and not being fit to be an athlete, among other vicious comments. Now, the CCP uses these international competitions to win points for the party, and the athletes and coaches are told that their wins will honor the party. And so there's a lot of psychological trauma, pressure involved, along with, of course, the extreme training regimen. Now, the reaction of netizens to this missed gold opportunity also confirms that it's really not about raising sportsmanship in the system, but it's about building up propaganda for the CCP. Years of nationalistic education in China have tied sports competition to politics. Losing a game and losing a gold medal becomes a political issue. The value of a Chinese athlete is to win or be called a traitor. Chinese men's gymnastics team lost.
A lot of people did not think it was appropriate for you to be here today. You have pushed false claims about some of your rivals. You have told 4 congresswomen of color who were American citizens to go back to where they came from. You have used words like animal and rabid to describe black district attorneys. You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. Why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? Are you with ABC? Because I think they're a fake news network, a terrible network. I came here in good spirit. I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country. And let me go a step further. I was invited here, and I was told my opponent was going to be here. It turned out my opponent isn't here. You invited me under false pretense. And then you said, you can't do it with Zoom. Well, you know, where's Zoom? She's going to do it with Zoom, and she's not coming. And then you were half an hour late. They couldn't get their equipment working, or something was wrong. I have been the best president for the black population since Abraham Lincoln. That's my answer.
Better than President Johnson, who signed the Voting Rights Act?
And for you to start off a question and answer period, especially when you're 35 minutes late because you couldn't get your equipment to work in such a hostile manner, I think it's a disgrace.
We will make America proud again.
She slammed that fucking guy. Hey, the fucking girl.
Hey everyone, it's Connor here from Durham Hearing Specialists. I hope you're doing well, and welcome back to a very unusual case, very, very complex case. This patient has several things wrong, and we're going to go through it step by step. I very rarely get worried about patients, but I am worried in this case because, you know, most of the time if there's an ear infection or some kind of pathology, it very rarely translates into anything nasty, anything systemic. But I am worried about this chap. Now, this chap has a mastoid cavity, which is basically where a surgeon has gone in and drilled away this part of the skull internally. So this part of the skull is called the temporal bone. Typically, you can think of it as where men start to go grey, their hair starts to go grey. And the portion of the temporal bone that surrounds the ear structures, we tend to call the mastoid bone. So I think it looks the inside of a crumpet. It's very similar to the kind of inside of a crumpet because it has lots of air pockets inside of it. And this little fragment here that I'm suctioning, so that you have to imagine that the ear canal is not a lovely kind of tubular structure, it's just a huge cavity on the inside. And this little fragment here that I'm sort of trying to remove, this is what we call a sequestrum, or a bony sequestrum, or the plural of that would be sequestra. But what this is a piece of bone that has died, or necrotized, and flaked off into the cavity. And you may be thinking, well, that doesn't really, are you sure that's bone? It doesn't really look like bone. It's definitely bone. And the reason that we know that is, first of all, just the way it felt in my hand as I was kind of tapping it and so on. It you know, it was very, very hard, like kind of a spoon on brick kind of feeling in my wrist. But also we ran some lab tests on it. So what we did, if you're interested in the detail, in part 2, I'll upload some of the microscopy videos. This is what it looks like under a compound microscope. But the gist of it is that we took this little fragment and immersed it in potassium hydroxide for 48 hours, occasionally kind of swilling it around. And if that was just dead skin, it would have dissolved very, very quickly in the potassium hydroxide. But this little fragment was quite happy in there after 2 days. If anything, it looked cleaner and whiter. So it's definitely bone. And that is a worrying sign. Also, these kind of yellow fragments here, very, very hard, very distinctive feeling that I'm getting in my wrist. This is not just dead skin. It's not normal stuff that you would suction out of an ear. So there's bone that is necrotizing and flaking off into the cavity. So I suppose you could consider that to be a diagnosis of osteomyelitis or evidence of osteomyelitis, which implies that there's been chronic infection in this mastoid cavity, which has caused the bone to lose its blood supply and then for the bone to die and then flake off, as I said, in the form of sequestra. But the cavity is still infected. There's still infection in there because of this thing here. So if I tilt the endoscope right up, sort of towards the ceiling, you see that little red splodge right there? Looks like a cherry or a raspberry, surrounded by white stuff, which is pus. That also should not be there. So that looks to me, again, it's very, very difficult to get a good look at it. It's almost impossible to get close. Again, I'm tilting the endoscope right up towards the ceiling. So I'm looking up inside this cavity. And that looks to me like granulation tissue, which again is a sign of chronic infection. It's a sign of trauma or chronic infection or damage, basically. So granulation tissue is, you tend to think of it as there's also some fungal overgrowth here, all these little white splodges. You tend to think of granulation tissue in connection with wounds or burns or ulcers. So if you imagine if you fell off your motorcycle, you would have the ulcer, which would be filled with this pink stuff, granulation tissue. So what you have to imagine here is that all this stuff is drilled away where the arrows are, normal mastoid bone, okay? And so this is a kind of, the procedure would have been a wall down, a radical wall down mastoidectomy, which would get rid of the posterior wall and the superior wall of the ear canal, creating a cavity. And the granulation tissue is kind of up inside the cavity, so it's kind of there, I think, roughly. So we'll get up another diagram because this isn't showing the brain. There, so this is a slightly better diagram. And hopefully you can see from the diagram that actually there's not much space, there's not much distance between the middle ear and the brain. So, and in fact, the roof of the middle ear, which we call the tegmental wall or tegmen tympani, there isn't that much bone there separating the roof of, separating those two spaces. And that's why cholesteatomas are so dangerous, because the cholesteatoma can then erode the tegmen tympani and then you're into the brain. So you can get meningitis or a brain abscess, something like that. So, I'm fairly, to some degree, worried about this patient, and I've rushed him through to ENT. Just as a side point, there's this little kind of pocket here, which I'm examining. And if you ever want to know what being heavy-handed looks like during a suction procedure, this is a very good example. So this is what not to do. My colleague was looking over my shoulder at the time, and we were sort of remarking, look at this pocket, I wonder if it's filled with keratin. And you can see here I'm kind of scraping away and scraping away. This will cause bleeding. So nothing major, but this kind of rubbing and abrasion with the Zollner probe is not really that good technique. See that right there? So in any case, this granulation tissue that's right up inside the cavity, I was very worried about. Now, the problem is that I'm not an expert in mastoid cavities. I don't do these mastoid operations. That's within the realms of an ENT surgeon. So, although it's abnormal, I'm not entirely sure if I'm justified